The job listing looked ordinary enough that I almost scrolled past it. Content strategy, lead, Varden Solutions, competitive salary, remote hybrid, strong company culture. All the language that sounded good and meant nothing until you were actually sitting in someone's open-plan office watching people argue over the thermostat. But something made me stop. Maybe it was the phrasing in the responsibility section. The way whoever wrote it actually seemed to understand what content strategy was, rather than treating it like glorified copywriting. Maybe it was the mention of long-form editorial work, something most companies listed and then promptly ignored once you were on board. Or maybe it was simply that I had been staring at job boards for 6 weeks and my eyes were starting to blur everything together, and this one happened to catch the light differently. I bookmarked it. Then I closed my laptop and made coffee. Then I came back, opened the laptop, and read it again. Then I made a list of reasons to apply and reasons not to. The list in favor had 5 items. The list against had 1. I know nothing about this company. A reasonable concern. I remedied it with 30 minutes of research, which told me that Varden Solutions was a mid-sized firm focused on digital infrastructure consulting, that they had been around for about 9 years, that their client list included several names I actually recognized, and that their website was clean and well-maintained, which I always took as a good sign about internal organization. What the research did not tell me was anything useful about the leadership. The website had an about page, but it was corporate in the worst way. Mission statements and value pillars and absolutely no photographs or names of the actual human beings running the place. There was a LinkedIn profile for the company, but it was sparsely maintained. I found a few press mentions, mostly about contracts and partnerships, but they were attributed to a communications department rather than anyone specific. In short, I applied knowing almost nothing about who I'd potentially be working for, which, looking back, is either the most embarrassing thing about this whole story or the most fitting. I submitted my application on a Wednesday afternoon. I spent longer on the cover letter than I had on any cover letter in recent memory, mostly because the job description actually gave me something real to respond to. I wrote about editorial vision. I wrote about the gap between content that performs and content that endures. I wrote about what I believed strategy actually meant, and I was careful not to use the word synergy even once. I hit submit, closed the tab, and went to make dinner. By Thursday evening, I had almost forgotten about it. My name is Ralph Morgan. At the time of all this, I was 31 years old, living alone in a 2-bedroom apartment that I justified by calling the second room my office and only occasionally feeling guilty about the square footage. I had spent 7 years building a career in content strategy, working my way from junior writer to senior editor to whatever I was now, which was employed but restless and increasingly aware that the company I was at had no intention of promoting anyone who wasn't already on a fast track that had been set before I arrived. I was good at my job. I knew I was good at my job. I had numbers that proved it and a portfolio that could hold its own against anyone's. What I didn't have was the particular kind of momentum that comes from being in the right place, and after 2 years at that company, I had decided that the right place was somewhere else. Hence the 6 weeks of job boards. Hence the 30 applications, the 12 interviews that went nowhere, the 3 second-round rejections that each stung a little more than the last. Hence the job listing that I almost scrolled past. I heard back from Varden Solutions in 9 days, which was fast enough to be encouraging and slow enough to suggest they were actually reading submissions rather than running them through an algorithm. The email was from HR, professional and warm in the right proportions, asking if I would be available for a first-round video interview the following week. I said yes. I picked Thursday. I spent the intervening days doing more research, finding somewhat more this time, a couple of industry articles, a mention in a digital infrastructure roundup, a Glassdoor page with a modest number of reviews that were mixed but tipped toward positive. The recurring theme in the positive ones was that leadership was accessible. The recurring theme in the negative ones was that growth could be slow. I took note of both and prepared my questions accordingly. What I still did not have was a name. The CEO was listed on the company's official documents as S. Hayes, which was public record because it had to be, but there was nothing more than that. No LinkedIn profile I could find, no photographs attached to any quotes, no speaking engagements or conference appearances. Whoever S. Hayes was, they maintained an almost deliberate absence from the kind of professional social media presence that most executives cultivated like a personal brand. I thought this was mildly unusual and filed it away. The Thursday of the interview arrived. I wore a shirt that looked professional on camera and comfortable off it, made sure the bookshelf behind me was presentable, tested my audio twice, and logged into the video call 5 minutes early. The HR interviewer was a woman named Diane, warm and efficient, with the manner of someone who genuinely liked people and also had 12 more interviews to get through that week. We talked for 40 minutes. She asked me about my process, my portfolio, my experience with cross-functional teams, my approach to measuring the impact of editorial work. I answered well. I knew I answered well because the questions were ones I had thought about deeply, and the answers came out shaped rather than scrambled. Diane told me they would be in touch within a week. They were in touch in 4 days. The second email informed me that I had been selected for a final round interview and that this one would be conducted in person at the Varden Solutions offices. It also told me, for the first time, the name of the person I'd be meeting with. Your interview will be with our CEO, Stan Hayes, it said, who leads all senior-level hiring for the Content and Communications Division. I stared at that sentence for a moment. Then I went to search for Stan Hayes. What I found was not very much. A brief professional bio on a conference website from 3 years ago. He had apparently given a talk on infrastructure strategy that included exactly one photograph. I looked at the photograph. The man in it was standing at a podium, not looking at the camera but at something off to the side, mid-sentence by the looks of it. He was tall. Brown hair that was slightly too long for the occasion. A jacket that fit very well. I couldn't make out much from a conference photograph taken at medium distance, but the overall impression was of someone who occupied space without performing it. The bio was brief. Stan Hayes, CEO of Varden Solutions. Background in engineering and operations strategy. Founded the company 9 years ago. That was it. I went back to preparing for the interview and told myself the photograph had nothing to do with anything. The Varden Solutions offices were on the 14th floor of a building downtown that had the good bones of something built 40 years ago and the polished surfaces of something renovated within the decade. The lobby smelled like coffee and the particular brand of recycled air that high-end office buildings specialized in. The receptionist was friendly and had my name on a list already, which was unremarkable and yet made me feel briefly, irrationally seen. Mr. Morgan, she said, with the precision of someone who had been expecting me specifically, Stan will be right out. Not Mr. Hayes. Stan. I sat in the waiting area and made notes in my head. Open floor plan visible through glass walls, natural light, people who looked like they were actually doing things rather than performing the act of doing things. A kitchen area where someone was making a pour-over coffee with the focused attention of a person who cared about coffee in a way that was either admirable or excessive. I hadn't decided which. I had been sitting for approximately 3 minutes when I heard footsteps and looked up. The conference photograph had been taken at medium distance and at an angle. It had not fully communicated certain things. The way he moved, for instance, unhurried but purposeful. The walk of someone who was comfortable in their own building without being proprietary about it. The way his attention landed on me across the waiting area before he had crossed half the distance, like he had already known exactly where I was. The way, when he smiled, it happened slowly, starting at the corners of his eyes before it reached his mouth. Ralph Morgan, he said, and my first name in his voice was not a question, it was a recognition. Something about the way he said it suggested he had read my name enough times that saying it aloud was a natural extension of already knowing it. I stood and extended my hand. That's me, Stan Hayes, Stan. He shook my hand with a grip that was firm and not demonstrative about it. Thanks for making the trip in. Come on back. His office was a corner room with 2 glass walls and 2 solid ones, the solid ones lined with bookshelves that had clearly been organized by someone who actually used them rather than someone trying to look like they did. There were no motivational prints. There was a whiteboard covered in writing that hadn't been erased, dense with arrows and shorthand that I couldn't read from where I sat. His desk had paper on it. Real paper, annotated and stacked with intent. He closed the door behind us and gestured toward the seating area. 2 chairs facing each other across a small table rather than the desk, which told me something about how he ran these conversations. Water? Coffee? He was already moving toward a small credenza against the wall. Coffee would be great, thank you. He poured 2 cups from a French press that was already made, which meant he had prepared it before this meeting. For a moment, I wondered if he had done it himself or if someone had done it for him. And then I noticed that the French press was slightly damp at the base, in a way that suggested someone had carried it from the kitchen not long ago. And for some reason, I found myself thinking that he had made it himself. He handed me the cup and sat across from me. His eyes were a shade of gray-green that the photograph had not captured, the kind of color that was hard to name precisely and changed slightly with the angle of the light. "I've been looking forward to this," he said, which was a perfectly ordinary thing to say in an interview. "And yet, so have I said. "I'll admit I did quite a bit of research on the company and found that you maintain a fairly low profile for a CEO." Something shifted in his expression. Amusement, maybe, with a layer underneath it that I couldn't read yet. "I get that a lot. I'm not particularly interested in being a public-facing brand." A pause. "I'm more interested in the work." "That's rare. Maybe. It's also just a preference." He picked up his coffee cup. "I want to talk to you about the role, but I want to talk to you first. Your cover letter was one of the better ones I've read in a while, which got you to Diane, and then the conversation with Diane got you here. So before we get into the technical side of things, tell me about the project in your portfolio, the regional heritage piece." I blinked. Of all the things I had expected him to open with, it was not the most obscure item in my portfolio. A long-form editorial project I had shepherded 2 years ago for a client in the cultural preservation space. The one that had taken 8 months and significantly more budget than originally planned, and resulted in a body of work I was genuinely proud of, even though it had only modest traffic numbers. "You read through the whole portfolio," I said. "I read through everything." Said simply, as a fact, not as a boast. The slight off-balance feeling of being genuinely prepared for shifted something in my chest that I chose, firmly, to categorize as professional. "Okay," I said. "The Heritage Project." I told him about it. I told him about the original brief, which had been uninspiring, and how I had pushed back and reframed the objective. I told him about the research phase, the editorial structure, the decisions we made about voice and about format, the arguments I had won and the ones I had lost and the ones where losing turned out to be right. He listened without interrupting, which sounds simple and is not. He listened with the quality of attention that made everything I was saying feel like it mattered precisely as much as it did. When I finished, there was a beat of silence. "Why did you push back on the original brief?" He was leaning forward slightly, elbows on his knees, the coffee cup held in both hands. Most contractors in that position would have done what the client asked. "Because what the client asked for wouldn't have worked," I said. "And if I had done what they asked and it hadn't worked, I would have been the one holding the failure. So I'd rather argue for the better approach and be responsible for something that might actually succeed." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "That's a good answer. It's also just true." Another small shift at the corners of his mouth. "I know. That's why it's a good answer." The interview lasted 2 hours. Not the kind of 2 hours that stretches uncomfortably because there's nothing left to say. The kind that closes suddenly, leaving you surprised that it passed so quickly. Like a book you look up from expecting to have read 30 pages and find you've finished 100. We talked about the role in depth. The team I would be leading, the existing strategy, where he wanted to take it and where he thought it currently fell short. He was precise about the shortfalls, not defensive, which told me that he already knew what wasn't working and had thought about why. He asked for my perspective on things and listened to it without prompting me toward the answer he was looking for. When I disagreed with something he said, I said so, and when I did, his response was to engage with the disagreement rather than redirect away from it. At some point, the conversation stopped feeling like an interview and started feeling like a conversation. I noticed the moment it happened and then immediately concentrated on not noticing it. When the 2 hours were up, he walked me back to the elevator himself rather than calling Diane or the receptionist. We stood at the elevator bank and he pressed the button and the elevator took slightly longer than usual to arrive. "I'll be honest with you," he said while we waited, "the position has been open for a while. We could have filled it faster. I've been waiting for something specific." "What specifically?" The elevator arrived. He held the door open with his hand, even though I hadn't stepped in yet. "Someone who argues for the better approach," he said. His eyes were doing that thing again, holding mine in a way that was direct without being aggressive. "Even when it's harder." I stepped into the elevator. "I'll be in touch," he said, and let the door close. I walked back to my car and sat in it for a full 2 minutes before starting the engine. There was a professional version of what had just happened, and then there was an honest version. The professional version was that the interview had gone extremely well, and I had a strong feeling I would be getting an offer. The honest version included all of that and also included the particular quality of his attention. The way he had said my name, the way the 2 hours had felt like both longer and shorter than they were, and the gray-green eyes that changed with the light. I was a functioning adult who had been in professional settings before, and I was fully capable of separating the two versions. I drove home, made dinner, watched something on television without taking in a single minute of it, and went to bed. The offer came on a Monday morning. Generous. More generous than I had expected. I spent 20 minutes reading it carefully, and then I spent approximately 1 additional minute making the actual decision. I accepted. My first day at Varden Solutions was on a Monday in early spring, the kind of morning where the light has that thin, new quality that makes everything look slightly more significant than usual. Diane walked me through onboarding with calm efficiency. Badge, system access, benefits paperwork, the rhythms and rituals of a company that had been operating long enough to know what new employees needed before they knew to ask. I met the content team, 5 people. All of whom I had read about before starting, and they were professional and welcoming in the way of people who had learned to reserve judgment until they had reason to give it. I had a workspace near the window. I arranged my things. I opened my laptop and began reading through the documentation Diane had sent. At 11:30, there was a knock on the open door of my shared workspace. "How's the first morning going?" Stan Hayes was leaning in the doorway, not filling it, not performing the role of CEO making a condescending check-in. Just standing there with his jacket off and his sleeves rolled to the elbow and a coffee cup that looked like the same French press cup as before. And the kind of ease that made the gesture feel genuine rather than obligatory. "Good," I said. "A lot of documentation. Or thorough." A pause. A pause. Probably too thorough in some areas and not enough in others. "Feel free to tell me which is which once you've had time to assess. I'll make a list. I expect you will." There was a beat, not an uncomfortable one. The kind of pause that exists when 2 people are having a conversation and neither of them is quite ready for it to end, but neither of them is reaching for a reason to extend it. "Lunch?" he said. "There's a place around the corner. Good soup, mediocre sandwiches. You'll want to know about it eventually." I blinked. Is this a CEO thing? Personal orientation tour? Something in his expression, very slightly, gave away that he found this amusing in a way he didn't intend to show. "It's a Tuesday thing. I usually eat there on Tuesdays. The invitation is being extended to you specifically because you look like someone who would appreciate being told the truth about the sandwiches." I looked at him for a moment, then I closed my laptop. "Okay," I said. "Lead the way." The place around the corner was called Finch's, and it had the comfortable, worn-in quality of somewhere that had been serving the same neighborhood for 15 years. We sat at a small table by the window. He ordered the soup. I ordered the soup based on his recommendation and the sandwich based on my own curiosity about whether the assessment was accurate. The sandwich was, in fact, mediocre. The soup was excellent. You were right, I said, at the point when this had become apparent. About which part? Both parts. I usually am about Finches. Not a boast. Just a statement of ongoing familiarity. He broke a piece of bread from the half-loaf they'd left on the table. Tell me what you thought of the documentation. And so we talked about work, which was, I told myself, the appropriate thing to do. He was my employer. This was a working lunch. The fact that the conversation moved easily between the formal and the informal. The fact that he remembered specific details of our interview 2 weeks later as reference points. The fact that eating lunch with him felt like talking to someone I had already known for longer than I had. All of this was incidental. The content calendar is a mess, I said. Yes. Is anyone here attached to it? Deeply and incorrectly. Can I fix it? That's why you're here. I nodded. The soup was genuinely good. I noted, without comment, that across 2 separate settings, now he had done something that I had rarely encountered professionally. He had hired me and then immediately indicated that I should do the thing I was hired for. This was rarer than it should have been. The team, I said, they're good. They are. They've been under-directed. Previous strategy lead was talented but not particularly decisive. Things accumulated. I can see that. The indecision or the accumulated things. Both. He smiled. He smiled. It was the slow smile that had started at the corners of his eyes, the one I had filed away after the interview and had been telling myself I hadn't. You're going to be good at this. I know, I said, not arrogantly, confidently, with the same register he had used when he said it. He looked at me across the soup and bread and the thin spring light through Finch's window. And for a moment his expression had a quality I couldn't categorize professionally, and so I categorized it as nothing and changed the subject to editorial workflow. Weeks pass the way they do when you are busy in a way you have chosen and the work is actually good. I rebuilt the content calendar. I had the diplomatic version of several necessary arguments and the more direct version of a few others. I implemented a structure that gave the team clarity without removing their autonomy. I met milestones. I sent reports. And on Tuesdays, without it ever becoming a formal arrangement, I had lunch with Stan at Finch's. It started as twice in a row, and then it became a pattern before either of us acknowledged it as one. He was always there when I arrived. Already at the table by the window, the soup already ordered, a second cup of coffee from the morning that he was finishing while he waited. I always ordered the soup. I occasionally attempted the sandwiches with inconsistent results. We talked about work approximately half the time and about everything else the other half. He had opinions about architecture and strong ones about city planning, which I found unexpected and entertaining. I had opinions about literature and even stronger ones about long-form journalism, which he found. He told me this directly, without any embarrassment about it. Interesting in the way of someone who wanted to know more about something he had not thought much about before. He asked me questions about things I had read and then listened to my answers with the same quality of attention he had brought to the interview. He remembered what I said from one week to the next, which should have been unremarkable and was somehow not. I told myself consistently that this was a collegial working relationship of the comfortable and productive variety, that having a boss you could talk to easily was an asset rather than a complication, that the warmth of these lunches was professional in nature and professional in character, and I was fully capable of keeping it that way. I told myself this with increasing effort as the weeks became 2 months. The industry conference was in a city 2 hours away by train, 2 days in length, and theoretically optional for anyone at my level. Stan mentioned it at lunch one Tuesday with the specific neutrality of someone who was presenting information rather than making a case. You'd be a natural for the editorial futures panel, he said, over soup that had gotten slightly better as spring progressed, or maybe I was just more attuned to it. Diane can put your name forward if you're interested. Are you going? Completely neutral tone from me. I go every year. It's useful for the operational side. A pause. The panel would be good visibility for you, and for the company. Then I'll go. He nodded. That was the entire conversation. It lasted 45 seconds. I spent the following 2 weeks telling myself this was simply a professional conference that we happened to be attending in the same capacity, which was two colleagues from the same company, which was normal and unremarkable. We took the morning train on the first day. He was already on the platform when I arrived, which I had not expected, standing with a coffee from the station and a bag over one shoulder. He was wearing a coat I hadn't seen before, darker than his usual jackets, the collar slightly turned up against the morning air. He looked, I thought very briefly and then did not continue thinking, like something out of a photograph that someone would actually keep. "Morning," he said, handing me a second coffee. I took it without comment, partly because I was surprised, and partly because there was nothing to say that wasn't either obvious or inadvisable. The train ride was 2 hours. We sat across from each other in a 4-seat section that was otherwise empty. He worked on something on his laptop for the first 40 minutes while I read through my panel materials. Then he closed the laptop, and we talked the way we talked at Finch's, but with the particular ease that travel creates. The sense of being in a temporary space that belongs to neither of you and so requires none of the maintenance of territory. He told me about the first year he attended the conference, when the company was young, and he had gone hoping to make contacts and mostly eaten several bad conference dinners alone while feeling underprepared. I told him about a conference I had attended early in my career that had been a masterclass in understanding exactly how not to present ideas. We were both, by the end of this exchange, slightly more comfortable in the way of people who have admitted to having been unimpressive in the past and found the other person unimpressed by the admission. The hotel was mid-range and well-organized, the kind of place that understood what professional attendees needed and didn't try to oversell the experience. Our rooms were on the same floor, a few doors apart. He walked me to my door, which was not far from his, and said good night in the same comfortable register he said everything. "Panel's at 11 tomorrow," he said. "I'll be in the audience." "You don't have to be." "I know." Simple. Closing nothing. His hand briefly on the door frame of my room before he turned toward his own. The panel went well, which I had expected because I was prepared and had been thinking about the topic for years. The moderator was sharp, the other panelists were substantive, and the conversation had the quality of an argument between people who were taking the subject seriously. I could see Stan in the third row from where I was sitting. He didn't look at me more than any other panelist. He looked at each of us when we spoke. But when I spoke, his attention had that specific quality I had been cataloging and refusing to name since the morning of the interview. After the session, during the reception, he found me near the drinks table where I was recovering from 45 minutes of sustained public-facing sharpness with a glass of sparkling water and the particular relief of someone who had done the thing and found it went well. "That was excellent," he said. "The point about reader trust was yours," I said. "You made it at lunch 3 weeks ago. I used it with attribution." Something in his face went very still for a moment, in the way of someone who has been told something they didn't know they needed to hear. "You remembered that. You said it well. It was worth keeping." He looked at me. The noise of the reception around us was considerable. Enough people, enough conversations, enough clattering of glasses and professional sociability that we were effectively in our own pocket of relative quiet. The light in the reception hall was warmer than office light, and it did something to the angle of his face that I noted and did not permit myself to think further about. "Dinner," he said. "Not the conference dinner. There's a place on the main street that Diane told me about. She said the pasta is genuinely good or good for a conference town? Both, apparently." Okay. The restaurant was small and unassuming, and the pasta was, in fact, excellent. We ordered a bottle of wine that was better than the price suggested, which he noticed and commented on, and we ate at a corner table with candles that neither of us had asked for, but that the restaurant apparently installed automatically when the light outside went from evening to night. We talked for 3 hours. Not all of it about work, not most of it by the second hour. He told me about why he had started the company. Not the polished version, not the narrative from the bio, but the actual version, which involved a job he'd left because the people running it had no idea what they were doing in a period of 6 months in which the company nearly didn't exist, and a decision made at 2 in the morning on a Tuesday because he couldn't sleep and everything looked clearer at 2 in the morning than it did in daylight. I told him about the job before this one, about the 2 years of knowing I was in the wrong place and the 6 weeks of job boards and the application I had almost not submitted. "What made you submit it?" he asked. "The job description. Whoever wrote it actually understood the work." He was quiet for a moment. "I wrote it?" I looked at him across the table and the candles and the excellent pasta. "You wrote a job description?" "I write all of them for this division. The HR department formats them. But the content is mine." A pause. "I know what I'm looking for." It seemed worth being specific about it. I turned my wine glass slowly. "And the 30 other applications, were any of those?" "Close." He was watching me with an expression I had, finally, somewhere in the second glass of wine and the candlelight and the 3 hours of talking, stopped trying to categorize professionally. But not what I was looking for. Which was? He looked at me steadily, the way he had looked at me in the elevator lobby and at Finch's and from the 3rd row of the panel session. The kind of looking that is unmistakably a kind of speaking. "I think you know," he said. The restaurant noise continued around us. A table nearby laughed at something. The waiter refilled the water without asking, and at our corner table, in the candlelight, I sat with the understanding that had been building for 2 months and chose, finally, not to argue with it. "We work together," I said. "We do. You're my employer." "Yes. I've been telling myself that's the reason not to." "I know. Quiet between us. Not uncomfortable. The kind of quiet that holds a question without pressing it." "I've been telling myself the same thing," he said, finally, in the same tone he used for everything, honest, without performance. "Since the interview." Since the interview. Since he had said my name in the waiting room like he already knew it. Since the elevator lobby, since the door held open, and those words, someone who argues for the better approach, even when it's harder. "Stan," I said. "Ralph." The way he said my name, the same way as the waiting room, the same recognition, but different this time, because the reason for the recognition was no longer the same. "This is complicated," I said. "Most things worth doing are." I looked at him across the table. "When did you know?" He considered this with the seriousness he brought to everything that deserved it. "When you told me you'd rather argue for the better approach and be responsible for something that might succeed." A pause, which was about 20 minutes into the interview. 20 minutes. I had been in the building 20 minutes and he had already. "You hired me anyway," I said. "I hired you because you were the most qualified candidate by a considerable margin and the right person for the role. Direct, clear. The rest of it." He stopped, looked at his wine glass, then back at me. "I told myself the same things you told yourself. I was quite firm about it. And now, we're at dinner." He said this simply, as if it were a complete answer. And in a way, it was. We walked back to the hotel along the main street, in the cool night air, not touching but not particularly far apart. The distance between us had the particular quality of a decision being held rather than made. At the elevator, he pressed the button and we waited. "I'm not going to make this difficult for you," he said while we waited. "At work, whatever this is or isn't, that's not—" He stopped, started again. "Your position is yours because you're good at it. Full stop. I know that. I did know that. I had known it since the first day, since the way he had immediately handed me the authority to fix what needed fixing. I'm saying it anyway." The elevator arrived. We got in. The doors closed. We stood side by side and watched the numbers. "Dinner again tomorrow," I said, after the closing session. He turned his head to look at me. That expression, the slow one, the one that started at his eyes. "Yes," he said. The second dinner was at a different restaurant, which we found by walking until one of us said that, "Looks good," and the other agreed. It was louder than the first night, a livelier place with a menu on a chalkboard that changed daily, and we sat at the bar because there was a wait for tables and neither of us proposed leaving. Sitting at a bar is different from sitting at a table. The space between two people calibrates differently. The angle is different. The accidental nearness when you both reach for something is different. His arm brushed mine when he turned to flag the bartender, and neither of us moved away from the contact. Small things. But small things are how everything begins. We talked about what we were doing and didn't talk about it directly. We talked around it in the way that two careful people circle something real before they decide whether to approach it. We talked about what both of us valued and what we had gotten wrong in the past and what we thought we understood now that we hadn't always. He talked about a relationship that had ended 3 years ago because he had been, by his own accounting, not present enough. Too much of himself given to the company in those early years when it had needed everything. He said this without self-pity and with the clarity of someone who had already done the work of understanding it. I told him about my last relationship, which had ended for different reasons and at a different pace. The slow kind of ending that doesn't have a definitive moment but accumulates into distance until you are two people sharing a space and not much else. I said I had learned from it what I needed in proximity. Not just physical proximity, but the other kind. The attentiveness, the willingness to be actually present with another person. He listened to all of this the way he listened to everything. "I'm present," he said quietly when I had finished. "I know." I turned my glass in my hands. "I know you are. That's the part that's complicated?" "Significant," I said. I was going to say significant. He looked at me for a long moment. The bar noise moved around us. A laugh from somewhere down the counter. The clinking of ice. His shoulder 3 inches from mine on the bar stool. "Ralph." My name in his voice, quieter than usual, the way it sounds when someone says a word they mean and are choosing to mean it. I don't know what the right speed for this is. I'm not going to pretend I do. Neither do I. But I know what this is, and I know I'm not interested in pretending otherwise. I looked at him, at the gray-green eyes that I had been studying for 2 months and that were currently doing the thing where they held mine without letting go. At the slight tension of someone who is being honest and waiting to see how the honesty lands. "I'm not pretending otherwise either," I said. He exhaled, not dramatically, just the small release of breath that happens when something you've been holding gets to settle. His hand, on the bar counter, moved approximately 1 inch, close enough to mine that the decision was mine. I closed the distance. His fingers were warm and still. We sat at the bar with our hands barely touching, not holding, not doing anything that the noise and the crowd around us would have noticed. And I felt the particular gravity of a small thing that means a large thing. He looked down at where our hands almost were and then back at me. "Okay," he said. "Okay," I agreed. We took the train home separately. His idea, my agreement, both of us understanding that the office knew we were at the conference and both of us choosing the slower road without making a speech about it. He sat 2 cars forward. I watched the same landscape through my window that he was watching through his. When the train arrived and we were walking through the station together, not conspicuously together, but together, he said, "Tuesday." "Finch's," I agreed. He smiled. "The slow one." Then he turned toward the exit and I turned toward mine. Tuesday happened. Finch's happened. The soup was the same. The bread was the same. The window was the same. And the spring light, a little warmer now because some weeks had passed and the season was progressing. What was different was the quality of the space between us, which had shifted in the way that spaces shift when two people have agreed, without ceremony, on what they are to each other. Nothing I could have named to someone from the outside. Everything perceptible from the inside. We talked about work, because work was genuinely worth talking about. The quarterly review was coming. A client presentation I had been leading had gone well. He told me about an operational development I had been curious about and that he hadn't been able to discuss before, but now could. And when we had talked about work and the food was nearly finished and neither of us was reaching for reasons to leave, he said, "Saturday." "What about Saturday?" "There's a bookshop I've been meaning to go to. The kind that has too many rooms and no obvious organizational system." A pause. It sounded like something you might have opinions about. I looked at him across the table. Outside, someone walked past the window. Inside, the comfortable noise of Finches on a Tuesday. His coffee cup held in both hands, his eyes doing the thing where they communicated something his words left room for me to address, or not. I have opinions about everything, I said. I know. The smile. Saturday then. The bookshop was called Argent and Sons. Though there was no plausible son in evidence, and it was everything he had said it was. Too many rooms, no defensible organizational system, the smell of paper, and the accumulated temperature of a building that had been absorbing people's reading habits for decades. We spent 2 hours in it. He gravitated toward the architecture and history sections, which I had predicted. I moved between literary fiction and the long-form journalism shelf, which he had apparently predicted, because he found me at the latter within 5 minutes of us separating and said, "There it is." With the satisfaction of someone whose guess had been confirmed, we didn't hold hands in the bookshop. We walked through rooms and debated whether the organizational logic was intentional or merely persistent, and occasionally held up a book for the other to assess. When we were in the same aisle, we were close enough that our arms touched without comment. He bought 3 books. I bought 2. And he looked at my selections for a long moment before saying, "I want to read that one when you're done," about the one I knew he would pick. "You could just buy it yourself." "I want to read your copy," said plainly, not coyly, just as a fact about how he preferred things. I looked at the book in my hand and then at him. Okay. After the bookshop we walked, because the afternoon was the kind that made walking the obvious thing. We found a park and sat on a bench in the way of people who have run out of destination without running out of company. He stretched his legs out and tipped his face toward the sun for a moment with the unself-conscious ease of someone who was comfortable enough not to perform being comfortable. "Can I ask you something?" I said. "Yes." The interview. I turned to look at him. "You said my name like you already knew me, before we'd spoken a word." He considered this. "I had read your portfolio 3 times, your cover letter twice. Your work has a very specific voice. When you know someone's voice well enough, meeting them is like..." He paused, looking for the right shape of it. "Recognition. Not familiarity exactly. Recognition. You knew my name before the interview, and you already knew me through my work." "Yes." "And then I walked in not knowing anything about you." "Not quite nothing," he said. "You knew I had a low profile. You said so. In the interview, I said it was mildly unusual. And I told you I was more interested in the work than in being a brand." He looked at me sideways. "That was true. It's also convenient when you don't want someone Googling you and forming an opinion before they've met you." I looked at him. "You deliberately maintain a low profile so that candidates come in without preconceptions." "I maintain a low profile because I find public-facing self-promotion genuinely uninteresting." A pause. "The other part is an incidental benefit. Did it matter? For me? Coming in without preconceptions?" He was quiet for a moment. The park around us was the particular kind of busy that reads as peaceful. Enough movement to be warm, not enough to be intrusive. "You argued with me," he said. "In the interview. Several times. You pushed back on things I said and presented your reasoning and didn't soften it. If you had known who I was, if you had been nervous or deferential in the way people sometimes are," he stopped, "you might not have argued." And arguing is what I was looking for. Someone who argues for the better approach, even when it's harder. "So you level the field," I said, "by not being findable." Something like that. I thought about this. It worked. Yes. He looked at me steadily. It worked. He walked me home. Not in the direction of his own apartment, which I now knew was in a different part of the city. Just walked me to my door, because we had been walking together, and the walk had to end somewhere. We stood on the step outside my building. The afternoon had shifted to early evening. The air was cooler. "Thank you," I said, "for the bookshop, for the afternoon. Any time. The simplicity of it. The genuineness of any time, rather than we should do this again." I looked at him in the early evening light, the book under my arm that he would read when I finished. The gray-green eyes, The ease of him, the particular ease of someone who was not trying to be anything other than what he was. Stan, Ralph. And then I reached up and kissed him. Not dramatically, not with any particular urgency, because urgency wasn't the register of this. Gently. The way you do something that you've decided on and don't need to rush. His hand came up to the side of my face, careful and warm, and he kissed me back with the same quality that he did everything, present, unhurried, meaning it. When we stopped, we were very close. His thumb brushed once against my cheekbone, and then his hand came down. "Okay," he said, in the voice he'd used at the bar counter when our hands had touched, like the word contained everything that needed to be said. "Okay," I agreed. There is a version of this story that focuses on the complications, because there were complications. There always are when two people work together and one of them runs the company. He was meticulous about it, about not allowing anything between us to affect the professional structure, about making sure my work was evaluated on its merits by the same systems that evaluated everyone else's, about being the kind of leader at the office that he would have been regardless of what was happening outside it. He was better at the separation than I initially expected, and I had expected him to be good at it. He had a quality of compartmentalization that wasn't coldness. There was nothing cold about him, but was rather the discipline of someone who took both things seriously enough to keep them whole. I was grateful for it. I was also occasionally impatient with it, in the way of someone who knew the right thing and found it requiring more effort than they'd calculated. We talked about this once on a Sunday morning at his apartment, which I had been spending Sunday mornings at for about a month by then. He made coffee the way he always did, with focus, and without making a performance of the focus. And we sat in his kitchen, which was exactly the kind of kitchen I had expected him to have. Functional. Organized without being sterile, a window that got the morning light. "Does it bother you?" he said. "How careful I am about it." I thought about the honest answer. "Sometimes. Tell me when." "When I want to be with you, and I'm in a meeting, and you're in a meeting, and I'm being professional, and you're being professional, and I know that later we'll be." I stopped. Tried again. "It's a thing to hold. Both versions of the same person, all day." He was quiet for a moment. "I know." He set down his coffee cup. "I find it." A pause, uncharacteristically. He was looking for the right word and not finding it immediately, which was unusual for him. "Significant," he said finally. "In both directions. The way you are at work is—" Another pause. "It's part of what I—" He stopped again. "Stan." I looked at him across the kitchen table. "You can say it." He looked back at me. The morning light, the coffee. Two people being honest in a kitchen on a Sunday. "I love how you work," he said. "The way you argue for things, the way you don't soften it, the way you care about it enough to be uncomfortable when it's wrong." He picked up his coffee cup again. "It's not separate from—" He gestured with the cup, meaning me, meaning us, meaning the whole thing. "It's the same thing, I can tell you that. Here." I looked at him for a long moment, the careful CEO who had maintained such precise separation, telling me in his kitchen that the separation did not mean the things were separate. "When I came to Finch's the third Tuesday," I said, "I wasn't hungry." He looked at me. "I went because I wanted to see you." That was the third time. The fourth and fifth, I think I told myself it was habit by then. But the third time, I knew what it was, and I went anyway. He was quiet. Then, very quietly, "I always got there first." "I know. I got there before you every time so I wouldn't miss you arriving." I absorbed this. The precise, careful man who maintained strict professional separation and every Tuesday arrived early at Finch's so he wouldn't miss me walking in the door. "Ralph," he said, in the voice he used when he was going to say something that mattered and was choosing to say it plainly. "Say it," I said. "I love you." Said the way he said my name in the waiting room that first morning. Like recognition. Like something he had known for long enough that saying it aloud was the natural extension of already knowing it. I reached across the kitchen table and covered his hand with mine. "I know," I said. "I've known for a while. And I love you." Simple. The only register that fit. He turned his hand under mine and held it. Spring became summer. Summer had its own quality, the heat pressing through the windows at Finch's, the city different in the evenings when we walked places instead of taking taxis, the particular way his apartment felt in the early mornings, with the fans running and the windows open and the sound of the city below. I read the book from Argent and Sons. He read it after me. We talked about it one Sunday for 2 hours, with the particular pleasure of two people who have opinions and want the other ones in return. He argued with my interpretation of one of the central characters. I argued back. Neither of us convinced the other. We agreed to disagree, and the disagreement didn't leave any edges. "This is what I wanted," he said, at some point during this conversation. "To argue about a novel? To argue about something that matters with someone who won't let me win just because." He was looking at me in the way I recognized now, the way I had cataloged and named and no longer filed under professional. At work, at Finch's, here, the same person. "I'm always the same person," I said. "I know, that's what I wanted." The quarterly review. I presented the results of the past 6 months of strategy work. The numbers were good. Genuinely good. The kind of good that didn't require framing. The team had grown into the structure we built together. The content output had increased in both volume and quality by metrics that could be defended against any question. Stan was in the room. He sat at the side, not at the head, which was where I was presenting from. He listened to the presentation with the same quality of attention he brought to everything, fully, without performing it. At the end, when the discussion opened, he asked 2 questions, both sharp, both things I had anticipated. I answered them the same way I had answered the questions in the interview, with precision and without softening. No one in that room could have read anything in his expression or his questions except for rigorous professional interest. He was scrupulously correct. After the meeting, in the hallway, briefly alone for 15 seconds, he said, "Excellent work. Thank you." And then someone else was in the hallway and we were colleagues. That evening, in his kitchen, he poured wine and said, "That was the best presentation in a quarterly review that I have seen in 5 years of quarterly reviews." "I know," I said. He laughed. I had been waiting approximately 6 months to make him laugh like that, fully, with his whole face, without the careful management he maintained elsewhere, and it was exactly what I had expected it to be. There is a moment, in any relationship that is genuinely working, where you stop being aware of it as a thing that is working, and it simply becomes the texture of your life. Not that you stop appreciating it, not that you take it for granted in the negative sense, but it becomes part of the structure rather than the object of attention, something that holds rather than something you are watching to see if it holds. This happened for us sometime in the late autumn. I couldn't have told you the specific day. It was more like a shift in light, the kind you don't notice happening and then you look up and the season has changed. We had been together, really together, for several months. We were careful at the office and ourselves everywhere else. We had learned each other's rhythms, his early mornings, my late reading, his preference for silence and mine for music, the specific ways in which we annoyed each other that were small enough to be navigable and important enough not to ignore. We had had 2 real arguments, neither of which had been about the office. Both of which had resolved without leaving anything unresolved. One Sunday, not a particular Sunday, he was reading in the chair in his living room and I was on the couch with a book and the fan was running and someone outside was mowing something at a distance. I looked up from my page and looked at him. At the top of his bent head, the particular angle of his shoulders when he was absorbed in something. The way he turned pages without taking his eyes from the text. And I thought, this is what I didn't know I was looking for. Not the job, though the job was right. Not even him exactly, because I hadn't known him. But this specific quality of being in the same space as another person and being completely at ease in the presence. The way 2 people who fit well together can share a Sunday afternoon without either of them performing the sharing of it. He looked up, as if the attention had weight. "What?" he said. "Nothing." I looked back at my book. "Just looking, a beat." Then, quietly, "Okay," he told me, about a year in, how it had actually happened. We were at Finch's, a Tuesday. Always, Finch's on Tuesdays. This one in the first cool days of autumn, with the soup back to its best seasonal form, and the subject came up because I mentioned having seen my original cover letter while looking through old files. I reread it, I said. It's good. It is, simply. As if this were a known fact, which for him it had always been. You said you read it twice. I said that, yes. Twice before you passed it to Diane. Yes. How many times total? He was quiet for a moment, his coffee cup, the window, the autumn light. More than twice, he said. I looked at him. The voice of it, he said, not as an excuse, as an explanation. When something is written really well, you go back to it. I went back to it a few times. Before the interview. Before the interview. I thought about this. About him in his office, in the evenings or the early mornings when no one else was there, reading a cover letter written by a person he had never met. About the way he had said my name in the waiting room. Ralph Morgan, not a question, a recognition. You said my name like you knew me, I said, before we'd exchanged a single word. I did know you, he said, in the way you can know a person through their writing. You were specific, precise. You had opinions that were yours and not assembled from other people's opinions. When I read you, I knew something about what kind of person you were. And when I walked in, and when you walked in, you were exactly what I had read. He looked at me across the soup and bread and 11 months of everything. That almost never happens, the person and the voice being the same. I thought about all the things that had to line up. The job listing he had written himself, specific enough to reach exactly the person he was looking for. The cover letter I had spent longer on than any other. The portfolio item he had opened the interview with. The elevator and the held door, and someone who argues for the better approach. I applied not knowing who you were, I said. I know. You knew my name before I walked through the door. Yes. And then you hired me for the right reasons. For the right reasons, he said. Full stop. I picked up my coffee cup. Outside, a Tuesday in autumn, the city in its ongoing motion. Inside, Finch's, the same table, the same window, the man who had written a job description specific enough to reach me and then read my name enough times that saying it aloud felt like recognition. I almost didn't apply, I said. I know. The cover letter took you a while. You mentioned it in the interview. I didn't know what I was applying to. No. He looked at me steadily. I knew what I was looking for. And there it was, the full shape of it, the whole arc from the Wednesday afternoon when I had finally pressed submit to this Tuesday, this soup, this table. The story of two people who came to the same place by completely different roads and found, on arrival, that the distance between them had been measured incorrectly all along. Stan, I said. Ralph. I'm glad I didn't scroll past it. He looked at me. The slow smile. The one that started at the corners of his eyes before it reached his mouth. The one I had first seen in a conference photograph taken at medium distance and now knew well enough to identify in dim light in profile at the far end of a room. So am I, he said. Outside, the city continued. Inside, the soup cooled slightly and neither of us reached for it. The Tuesday light came through the window, the way it always did, thin and particular, illuminating a table that had become the fixed point around which a year of becoming had quietly arranged itself. I had applied to the job without knowing who the CEO was. He had known my name before the interview, and everything after that. The careful distance, the 2 months of Tuesdays, the train, the candlelight, the bookshop, the Sunday mornings, the kitchen table, the argument about the novel, the quarterly review, the moment he laughed with his whole face. All of it had been the long answer to a question I hadn't known I was asking on a Wednesday afternoon when I pressed submit and went to make dinner. Some things are recognized before they are named. Some arrivals are prepared for by someone other than the person arriving. And some doors are held open long enough for you to realize, somewhere between the lobby and the elevator, that you were always going to walk through them. If you made it to the end, you're my kind of person. Leave a subscribe, comment down your favorite part of the story, and if you want early access to videos, exclusive content, or just want to support the channel, make sure to join our Patreon. Link is in the description. even one member genuinely means the world to me. See you in the next one.